Good morning. The winter is over, the sun is shining. You're back at FarmED for another edition of the FarmED podcast with me, Alex Dye, and my guest today, who has come back from his globe-trotting adventures. He is the co-founder of FarmED, the owner of Cotswold Seeds, and I've heard him referred to a couple of times as Mr. Herbal Lay. It is Ian Wilkinson. What are you reading there, Ian?
Oh, morning, Alex. Well, actually, I'm just reading the New Zealand Farmers Weekly.
Oh.
The trials and tribulations obviously happen over there as well as they do in the UK, and it's so many similarities, I can't tell you. Anyway, sorry, yes.
That's interesting. New Zealand. I wonder if that'll come up in our conversations as we go on.
Well, it might do.
So, let's go broad. Let's start off with the bigger question. How did you get to be where you are? How did you get to be Mr. Herbal Lay, Ian Wilkinson? Where did it all begin?
Gosh. So I wasn't from a farming family, but I went to the local agricultural college, having been an apprentice actually on a farm for 3 years. Brilliant little these days, 300-acre mixed farm in Berkshire, and we farmed literally a bit of everything: cows, milking cows, that is, beef animals, sheep coming into the farm, crops, woodland, grassland. You know, it was all there, and it was employed about 12 of us. Really vibrant place in the 1970s. This is for me. Then I went to agricultural college for 3 years. Met my lovely wife Celene there, and we actually once we left college, we went to work in Nottingham for a big pesticide company, Fisons and Boots it was called, and we had 3 years or so there before coming to the Cotswolds to join Cotswold Seeds, which actually had been going for 10 years when I joined it.
So it's interesting. You've already mentioned you were in a sort of, you worked on this farm and you worked for a chemical company. So we're going to talk more about regenerative farming as this conversation goes on. But I'm assuming at these sorts of times that wasn't something you were thinking about very much. The chemicals, the impact on the environment in terms of farming.
Growth was good. I mean, everything about the industrialisation of farming I participated in the early days of my work, and we thought that was amazing. I mean, we were literally doubling yields in a generation, and if you think about that, I mean, it's astonishing how much extra food was produced as a result of all the things that are in this Farmers Weekly. Using fertilizers to promote growth. In fact, there was the piece I was actually reading in there was a man who's retiring and saying on the back of his fertilizer business, that's what he did. He had a whole career in fertilizer. He literally doubled the world's food. And he says in this article that if you didn't put this nitrogen fertilizer on, you'd only have half the food. So he says that isn't a viable proposition for the world going forward in terms of the food from farming. And this is the view that we have had throughout our my farming time. I'm in my early 60s now, so nearly all of the time has been about promoting more yield. And what I think is really interesting is that those thoughts that we had and the training that we had wasn't really questioned at all, and we didn't think terribly much about the nutritional value of food, for example. It was much more about the volume of it, and it still is. That's how we are. But we're beginning to see or beginning to raise questions around the quality, shall we say. Can we add value? Because farmers are struggling worldwide with margins, with commodity production, and unless you're the most efficient, if you're on an average farm, it's very difficult to compete on a global stage where price is everything.
And what do you mean by adding value?
Well, how can we add value to a commodity food? Well, it's actually quite difficult unless you just reframe it and say, well, actually, this is about growing nutritious food for people in parallel with a healthy landscape. So we are, adding value for people that are prepared to pay for it. Now, I appreciate most of the world wants cheap food. I completely get that. That's been the policy we've all had all through my time. But there is a change going on, albeit relatively small numbers, but there's a change that's rippling through the food industry. Think about the very big global companies that dominate around the world. I think Nestle, for example, I believe has a policy for its major ingredients to be regeneratively farmed, 50% of them to be regeneratively farmed by, I think it's 2030. I stand to be corrected on that. But these big organisations now recognise the need to have truly sustainable food systems. And they are encouraging farmers through different methods of payment around the world, from what I've seen here and elsewhere, to do that. Now, it may not be enough, but that's the pathway we're on.
Do you think these big corporations and companies, like you say, do you think they see much of a difference between sustainable farming and regenerative farming?
I think some do. It's open to interpretation, isn't it? I mean, I think we're in agriculture. I think those of us farming are very much interested in the outcomes, and not just a box ticking exercise. We want to produce food in a healthy way, in the best way that we possibly can. That's always been what the farmers want to do. But there is this risk of greenwash, and people will just say one thing, but the proof has to be there. And in the future, I'm sure there will be a lot more regulations and certifications, and also, the use of, remote sensing. If you think about satellites roaming over the earth, how easy that is to do now. You can see what's going on in the land. So there is evidence of good and bad practices that can be monitored and paid for in the future.
I apologise, I've taken you off on a tangent almost immediately there, which is quite nice.
Sorry about that. Wound up, pent up.
So in terms of your story, you just finished at Thysons and Boots.
Yeah.
What was your next step?
So then I left the big company, not because I didn't agree with pesticides. I left it because it was huge, and a lot of people, and we were, I think in the time I was there 3 years, we went from UK ownership to West German ownership. It's before the wall came down, but you'll realise. And also then it was sold to a Japanese company. So this was the company I worked for was a global company. And I could sort of see my career path in it. But having come from a 300-acre mixed farm, with a dozen people, I was a little bit fish out of water. So I was really, curious to see whether there might be a future for me in agriculture that was smaller. And so I joined Cotswold Seeds in the 1980s, of course, now. And Robin and Susan Hill took me on as a junior. And I guess I had all the energy and enthusiasm, but no real knowledge or wisdom, which they had, and they very kindly shared with me over decades. And so, through good fortune, you might say, and lots of hard work on their part, and I hope on my part too, but there was this, opportunity that I took. And at the time, grass seeds, of course, is what this seed business does, and it supplies just the UK's farmers, was the poor man of the seed trade. And it was interesting because in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, everything was becoming much more industrialized, monocultures, just wheat everywhere, it seemed to me, or cedar rape and things. And the role of grassland was diminishing in the arable rotation. It's still, of course, a big part of the UK's agriculture. 2/3 of the agriculture in the UK is grass. But the importance of it was not considered to be that great. And I think all the research money and all the the big jobs, as it were in the arable sector. And so for me, just quietly beavering away on the grass seed side while nobody else was interested in it was a good opportunity for me. So the business grew gradually. I mean, it grew really slowly over decades, and the farmers that supported us appreciated the detail that we did. So it was good, and still is, very good technical advice and service, and it's as simple as that. So that was the differentiating thing when other people weren't that interested in it, and that's a bit unfair on my good friends and colleagues in the seed trade, but most people were much more interested in where the money was, which was in wheat and those combinable crops. So but of course it's turned out in over time that grass seeds and the things that they produce, in other words, grassland and habitats and carbon sequestration and soil improvement and cover crops and all these things that are now very much part of a regenerative style of agriculture have come back into fashion. So suddenly everyone and his dog sort of quite keen to know what's going on in the small seed trade, which has been really exciting, and our business has benefited as a result of that, as others have too. So things come and go, we know that, don't we? But yeah, we were fortunate. But then we've been at it for 50 years. I mean, the business is 50 years old now. And the team, if you're wondering, I mean, I do put an appearance in, but the team, at Moreton in Marsh is astonishing, and they're incredibly effective, much more than I ever was when I was there, I think, full time. So I'm really grateful to them, but also, one thing that has become glaringly obvious to me is that as time goes on, I'm, as as the sort of first owner, if you like, in my generation of the business, it's I'm not going to be here forever. So it's really important and incumbent on me to make sure that there is succession and that that things go on in the way that they should. So yeah, that's my role really, is to make sure that happens.
And you've ended that on a very nice point there about the succession, the future of all these things, the future of these businesses. So do you mind if I ask really quickly, how does FarmED as an entity come into all this? Where does FarmED begin?
So so 15 years ago, roughly, Celene, we'd always had trials grounds, and we'd always been experimenting and been involved with research, and with others. We were collaborators with other researchers, really good academic researchers, and we'd had these trials grounds, and we could see the value of them, but they weren't quite field scale enough. They weren't really farming trials. They were sort of small, size of a room, and you might have dozens of them. But we just felt that the biggest change we could think of, biggest beneficial change in agriculture, would be to engage other people in farming who were not necessarily aware of what it could contribute in the future, but were stakeholders. So these might be people in the food business, it might be students, it might be policymakers, and we just felt that if we could have a place where people could come and talk to each other and hopefully create solutions to what, frankly, are massive challenges the world faces, and a lot of those are related to the land, then there might be a role for something like FarmED. So we looked around for land, and as everyone knows, it's not for the faint-hearted. It's so expensive if you want to go farming, and it's the same everywhere pretty much in the world now, that land prices are really high and a real obstruction to new entrants. But I was a new entrant. I always wanted to farm. I always had that idea of that dream of farming. And this little farm, it is a little farm, it's 107 acres, came on the market, went to auction, and the seed business honestly really struggled with the first few decades. I mean, we were sort of slight surplus, slight deficit on our accounts for years. But about 15 years ago, things started to change for us, really in light of more demand for the seeds that we were supplying. And we had a few £100,000 in the bank account. And that's what got us going on the farm. We used it as a deposit to take a mortgage from the agricultural mortgage company. And then we had a farm.
Quick tangent. What do you think it was that changed the fortunes of Cotswold Seeds around that sort of time?
I think it was just slow progress. I mean, we didn't do anything clever. We were just really keen to build a solid business that had a reputation that was second to none in the field of work we were doing. And so there was no sort of miracle ingredient. It was just every single time we picked the phone up, or we went to a farm, or we mixed some seed, or whatever it was, we would just do the very best that we could for that task. And if you keep doing things as best as you can, you would hope that you would become really good at it. And that's always been the mantra that I was taught by Robin and Susan, and I followed through, and I know the rest of the team do exactly the same thing. I was there last week, and I was hearing exactly what what we were thinking 50 years ago. So nothing has to change if you keep doing it, and if you're patient. I mean, the thing about agricultural businesses, they are so different to any other business. Pretty much every other business I come across outside of food and farming tends to be build it quickly and sell it. Venture capital gets involved in all these things, and it's fantastically interesting, except that in agriculture you can't do that. It doesn't work like that. You're dealing with family farms, very often generations of the same family on a farm, and to work in that environment, it requires slow, methodical thinking and not quick bucks. So that's really, I think, has been the key to our success, and it just takes time. I mean, it was an overnight. It was a, what's the term I'm thinking of? Sort of like an overnight success over 50 years.
So your fortunes had changed at Cotswold Seeds.
Yeah, we're not blasé. I mean, I've always felt we're as good as our last order. And yes, things have got it. We've progressed more. And we put our roots down more. We employ more people, and we sell more seed. But we're still a small company. We employ 25 people. We deal with 20,000 farmers, and we're not. We don't feel the need to dominate the world at all. We just want to do a really good job that is sustainable and that people value.
But you'd things had gone well. You'd had a team. You were happy. You were comfortable with that. You started thinking about where can we make a place for people to come and talk about all these things. And you went out to go and look for land.
Yeah.
And
So the farm came on. This farm where we are now, FarmED, Honeydale Farm, came on the open market, and for a farm of this size, which is relatively small, it would be really difficult for most broadacre farmers to make this a viable proposition. But we were more, interested in making it a really interesting place where people could discuss difficult challenges, because we know, our business, the seed business, is dependent on a healthy agriculture. So we know how important it is, and we just felt that if people were to gather and convene as they are today and as they do every day here, that the conversations would be really rich and interesting and hopefully would lead to solutions. And when we first came, we didn't have, it was a dirt track off the main road, no facilities, no toilets, no car park, no coffee, it was pretty basic. But what we found were people were still coming down the farm drive. We'd put up some basic trials, so we'd divided the fields up into sort of small blocks of crop rotations, and we kept some control areas so that we have something to compare it to. So this is what it was like before, and this is what it's like if you change the farming system. And we were looking at using nitrogen fixing legumes to build soil fertility, deep rooting plants to be drought resistant, how we might protect watercourses, how we might plant other crops that were long term. So for example, with an orchard, we've got quite a lot of orchard, we've got a lot of agroforestry strips here. We reintroduced livestock into the farm, which is very important from a diversity perspective. We've got horticulture on the farm, and we got a lot of people on the farm. Now it's astonishing actually, because when we first came there was literally no one, and now we've got I think 35 people one way or another. You and I are on the farm, and there's a bunch of people around us all doing different things, and some of them it's their own business, and others are employed at FarmED and so on. And it's astonishing what 100 acres can do when you think about it. But because all that's going on, people come. So we work on the same site as our local farming cluster, for example. There's 150 farmers in our local cluster. We're just going into an ELM scheme, so a landscape recovery scheme, the even load landscape recovery scheme. And this is all very collaborative work with local farmers. And we're all different. We're all completely different and doing different jobs. But it's really interesting to see how we're all thinking about the future. And it's, hot topic around every farm is, what next? Wherever you go, it's what we're going to do next, because we're facing these huge challenges, and everybody wants a piece of agriculture, whether it's for food or for environmental delivery or cleaning up the rivers, whatever it might be. Farms and farmers are in the driving seat.
And all these years later, here we are, courses, talks, events, talking about podcasts, absolutely, talking about food and farming in the environment.
Yeah.
And speaking of food and farming and the environment, globally, not just here in the UK, a few months ago, you were given, you had the opportunity to take something of a sabbatical. And that's something that I think most farmers would probably agree is not something that often happens for a lot of farmers. So how did that opportunity present itself, and why did you decide that now is the time?
Well, yeah, it's about, I wasn't sure what the word means exactly, but we had a family wedding halfway towards New Zealand, and we thought, we've always wanted to go. It's like a pilgrimage, isn't it, for farmers? The amount of farmers I've known that have been to New Zealand, everyone says to me, have you ever been? I say, oh no, one day. And I never
why
thought,
is that? Why specifically
I don't
New
know
Zealand?
Exactly. Well, when I was at college, we had kiwis coming over, and in fact, we had a lot of people from around the world, but kiwis in particular would come over and do a year in the UK. It's part of their pilgrimage, I suppose. So I just thought, well, maybe one day. And anyway, we had the chance, and it was the winter, and from our perspective, we've got great teams at FarmED and at Cotswold Seeds. And so we thought, well, we're in our early 60s. If we don't do it now, we might never do it. So we went, and we spent a few weeks in New Zealand, and actually in Australia as well on the way there. So we saw, we were trying to, it's like farmers always say, get off the farm once a week and get out of the county once a month. And, in this case, we got out of the country once a year, if you like. And I've never taken a long holiday. You don't in farming particularly. And so this was an opportunity to do that, and we were really grateful for it. And I hadn't fully appreciated how interesting it would be. I mean, we going in the winter was quiet time for work for me, so that was really helpful. But we couldn't help but look over the fence, what's going on, or look out the window if we're driving around. And we pretty much use every method of transport. So we went on, railway journeys. We went on buses and cars, and we saw so much. We literally went across the length of Australia, and so we went from the farming areas. By the way, a lot of Australia is farmed. People think it's a big wilderness and outback, and it is. And when you go across it, it just goes on and on for days. It took us 4 days to get across it on a train.
Wow.
The outback. We went from Sydney to the west coast, which is Perth, and it's a long way. And you go through the farming areas as we did in that journey. So we sort of saw Victoria and New South Wales and South Australia. And I have never seen so many cows. I knew there was wheat belts, which we saw, quite big areas of wheat. I mean, the Australians grow quite a lot of wheat. It sort of rivals the UK, really, in very round terms. They don't have quite the same yields as us. There's quite a lot of regenerative farming going on over there. Good farming, big, broad acre farming. But the number of cows absolutely astonished me. And I had to look it up to see how many they had. And I think it's 27 million. I mean, to put that into context, the UK has got a lot less. I mean, I think I've actually got the numbers here. So we've got 2 million dairy cows and 9 million beef animals. So the Australians have got 2 million dairy cows, mostly for their own consumption. They export a bit as well, dry powder and stuff. But they've got 27 million beef animals, and we got 9 million.
It's a huge difference.
I couldn't believe it. You couldn't move for, Aberdeen Angus and Herefords and cows. Some cows I hadn't even got a clue what they were.
So why is that? Is that just because the land suits it, or is it a cultural thing? Or
it's big stations. I mean, they've got big ranches and stations out there, and their stocking rates in these big areas are almost wilderness. They seem to me to be, thousands and thousands of animals across tens of thousands of acres. So it's a very different style of farming on a lot of it. I mean, some of it's quite intensive, but a lot of it is set stocking in big areas. And I mean, how they count the numbers of animals, I do not know, because there's just such a big area. But yeah, a lot of it's farmed, and the soils are really old. I mean, geologically speaking, the Australian soils are really old. And so they're not many of them are not as fertile as ours. So for them to regenerate those soils, rebuild those soils is really important, and for their farming system to carry on. But they've got a low population. I mean, I think they're less than 30 million people in total. We've got 70 million in the UK, and Australia is massively bigger, as you know. You've been, I know, you were telling me you've been once as a child, which you must go back to, by the way.
Didn't do anything as exciting as you did, I don't think.
I don't know. I mean, it was brilliant. You're probably going to ask me about kangaroos, aren't you?
I mean, inevitably. We have to, don't we?
Well, so I don't mind driving a bit, and we drove quite long stretches. It's a long way to get anywhere. So some of the coastal routes we did, mainly because it was a beautiful country, and we were keen to sort of get out and see stuff. So when we went on a train or a bus, we were on a car, and most of our driving was in the day because that's when you see things. And there was this one particular day where we'd been looking at some interesting things, and we were late. And we had to get quite a long way, maybe another 100 miles or so, along the coast. And it got dark. And a couple of people have said to us, they don't like driving in the dark, because it's dangerous. And I just thought, well, it's like the UK. Yeah, of course, driving is dangerous. But what I hadn't appreciated was why it was dangerous. So we were driving along. It was getting dark, and we were thinking there was nobody else on these roads. I mean, this is like the main outer circuit of Australia we're driving around. There's one route round it, and it's the M1, if you like. Nobody on the roads. And then we see these little things hopping across the road every now and again. Crikey. Little kangaroos, and then there's bigger kangaroos. And it's like there's this invasion of kangaroos on the road. It is so dangerous because they jump out at the last minute. It's like a deer. Everyone's had the experience of a deer jumping out. But there's something terrifying about kangaroos. They are big, some of them. Huge things. And yeah, there's a reason they put beware kangaroo signs up everywhere, because they do not mix with traffic. Anyway, so that was a real eye opener. So from then on in, we drove in the day, mostly because we wanted to see stuff. More cows, actually, everywhere we went, and vineyards and all the other things the Australians are known for.
So
they do very well.
Across either Australia or New Zealand, just from like a bird's eye view then, so you mentioned sort of the cows. Were there any striking differences from British agriculture that you noticed immediately that you just thought that is so different to how we do it in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much variation. It's really difficult to generalise. I suppose the biggest thing I noticed in New Zealand was the similarities. Actually, I mean, it was the winter here and it was the summer there. So we were in the summer in grassland country, and New Zealand, roughly about half of it's farmed, roughly speaking. A lot of dairy, a lot of beef, and some sheep. And I think if you think about New Zealand geography, if you haven't been there, and the first time I'd been, I was really quite struck by it. There's mountains, which runs right down the middle of both the North and the South Island. They're similar size islands. And the population's 5 million people. And the people there earn their money from tourism, farming, and forestry. That's the three big enterprises that prop up New Zealand. It's not dissimilar in Australia, actually, although they have a lot of mining going on, which is one of their massive income streams. But I think because the rural community is really important in both countries, but particularly in New Zealand, it was striking to see how everything evolves around the farms. It felt like that to me anyway. Grass and the crops, the crops were very limited. I mean, I hardly saw any cropland. It didn't feel like, we drove around most of New Zealand, or went on a train and saw most of it, both islands. And it was very dominated by commercial forestry, but mostly agriculture, grassland agriculture, big dairy units. The dairy units would be bigger than the UK's, mostly, on average anyway. The farms are mainly owned by the farmers. 90% of the farms are owned by them, and the UK is about half.
Yeah, so that's quite a big difference.
Yeah, and the other half tenanted in the UK, but the big difference, yeah. So the farmers really have got skin in the game, if you know what I mean there. And they are very strong units, I would say. There's a lot of agricultural shows and a lot of rural, community events going on, as you would expect. It felt a little bit like I imagine the UK was. A lot of people say it's like the UK was 50 years ago. I think that's a bit unfair, actually, in a way. But there was definitely less population, and if you took the tourists out of the equation, we actually get a lot more tourists, by the way, to the UK. But New Zealand does have a very strong influx of visiting tourists from all around the world. But New Zealand is and Australia are made up of people that have often been there for 2 or 3 generations from Europe. A huge number of European families in New Zealand, and a lot of those are farming families. So I think that was, I suppose, the importance. What I'm really saying is the importance of agriculture was valued in society more than I would suggest it is currently in the UK, which I think is a shame in the UK. But definitely in that case, it is the case there. And I think the New Zealand's strength in agriculture is that they have the perception is they have this very green, production system of grassland. It rains a lot. In some parts of New Zealand, they get 5 metres of rain, can you believe, on the west coast, where, on the rainy side of the mountains. And elsewhere, if they don't get the rain, they irrigate the crops. So they got lots of rivers. I mean, you've got huge amounts of water flowing through New Zealand. It's a glacial country. There's a huge amount of water. And they pump that out of the rivers onto the grassland and the crops to grow grass. So if you go to dairy country, you just see these huge irrigation rigs running through the paddocks. A lot of mob grazing going on. And actually, the one thing I did notice was quite a lot of use of alternative species. And a lot of the researchers there that we were looking at were talking about the use of alternative forage species, because it's a forage country, and it has been based on ryegrass and nitrogen fertiliser, like the UK has been recently. But they're looking at alternative legumes for protein production for their cows, for carbon sequestration. So all these things are happening. Carbon markets, they're all, they come and go, but they're all happening in New Zealand and Australia too. So it's really, really interesting. But grass dominated. And, the other really interesting thing was the numbers of beef animals again. There was a huge number of beef animals. And when I was a boy at college, agricultural college, with my Kiwi friends, I had to check this figure, but I know it's right because I have checked it. There were 70 million sheep in New Zealand when I was a kid. Very loosely speaking, I think in the UK we got 30 million, just to put it into context. So we're a big sheep country. But they had 70 million, a country the same size as us. But now they've only got about 25 million. So I didn't see as many. So that really surprised me. I thought there's going to be sheep everywhere. No, there was a lot less than I had anticipated, but a lot more cows.
Do you know why that is?
Well, difficult to say, really. I guess, I mean, China and India have got even more sheep than New Zealand. You know, they're well over 100 million each of those countries. I guess there's more production around the world now than there was. Tough markets. New Zealand doesn't have any financial support from its government. Sorry, New Zealand farmers don't have any.
In terms of like incentives and things.
Yeah, they've had to change the system quite a bit, and I think they've seen the dairy industry has increased massively over there, and they're exporting a lot of milk products, dry products, powders, and things like that, to all over the world, Asia and even Europe. So, and the trade deals seem to be really big for these guys too. I'm no expert on this, I should say, but it's very clear that Australia, I think, has problems with exporting beef into China, which is a massive market for them, whereas the New Zealanders seem to have a better relationship with them somehow, and just almost free to export into the market. And the beef price over there was really good. I mean, I think beef prices generally have been quite good. Strong wool prices have been really good in New Zealand. So there's sort of like there's areas where the farmers that produce these enormous quantities of meat and wool and milk actually have done quite well. I mean, there was no organic food in New Zealand, which really surprised me. I mean, that's not quite true, but there was no real emphasis. I mean, the UK and in Europe, there's obviously quite a lot of emphasis around organic production, but in New Zealand there was, well, you didn't see any. And I looked into it, and I think Fronterra, the big dairy cooperative, have done some production of organic milk in the North Island, and they're just starting in the South Island because they think there's demand coming. But I was very surprised, because I would have thought, from an organic perspective, it would be very easy to produce milk and meat products organically in a what is basically it rains, it grows grass country. But the market wasn't there.
It's really interesting, isn't it?
Really interesting, yeah.
And was there anywhere on your travels, any particular farm or particular place that really stood out to you for any particular reason, be the farming practice or the way it looked or whatever it might be?
Well, I think what was really interesting for me was seeing a real delineation between nature and the wilderness, the wild country, which both have, and the farming. So in New Zealand, for example, there were the forestry area, the forest. So these are like rainforests. These are proper old forests that have so much richness. It's unbelievable. One of the, really biodiverse, incredible country, and there's so much of it. And then right next to it is the farming. So you have the massive areas where you could walk or drive or travel for miles and miles and miles, see nobody, and there's no human interference whatsoever. And then in the valley, on these big plains, Christchurch and places like Canterbury and places like that, and they exist all over New Zealand. These plains, there is intensive agriculture, and it might be vineyards. There's areas of very large areas of vineyards for New World wines, which are doing quite nicely, I believe. And then big, rotationally grazed paddocks for cows and so on. And then you've got the sort of borderlands where there's a lot of more sheep and beef, where the stocking rates are lower, so there's less intensity. But the contrast between the wild areas that are not farmed. In the UK, we farm more of our land, I would say, quite a lot more of it, and we're sort of more integrated into the nature parks and national parks and things like that. There, it's not the case so much. It seems to me. I mean, I only was there for a few weeks, and I can only tell you what I saw. But the wilderness in New Zealand and the outback in Australia were pretty special places. I thought I enjoyed being in them, but they weren't farming.
And you mentioned in New Zealand there was this huge amounts of farmland and the forestry as well. Is there a lot of agroforestry going on? Is there a big agroforestry scene out there?
Great question. Well, yeah, there's two things I noticed. One was that the managed forestry. So basically, it's grow a crop. Think of some of your stereotypical thought around monoculture, for, pines in Wales. Apply that to New Zealand. So they were clearing areas of land, growing pines, one species, and then cutting them after 40 years, whatever it is. So there's a lot of that gone on. You can see it. You can see huge areas of the countryside being completely, devoid of any forestry, and then being replanted. So it depends where you look as to where you are in the rotation of that cycle. But yeah, there's a lot of that going on. But the confusion over carbon credits and things, it is so clear that landowners and land managers are not really sure what to do, and they're pulling out of forestry plantings at the moment. But it was the monoculture element of it that bothered me. I love diversity in farming and forestry, but I was sort of surprised they were doing that. But they're obviously doing it for good reason, and it works for them. I saw one lumber yard, one of the coastal ports, which I've the video of, which was really interesting because it was enormous. I have never seen anything like it in my life, and the video that I've got shows this boat being loaded with unsawn logs, so big pine logs, and I believe that somebody else will be adding the value by sawing it up when it gets to China or wherever it's going. Massive imports to China of timber. So that's a really good business for New Zealand if they can keep up with the planting. But the stark contrast between monoculture forestry and the biodiverse rainforests was astonishing for me and anyone that cares to look. So invasive species were interesting. There's a lot of control with so kiwi is the national bird, which New Zealanders value very much.
Did you see the kiwi whilst you were out there?
Yeah, but only in a conservation area. We didn't. They're nocturnal, so unsurprisingly, we weren't out in the forest at night. but
that's not the same issue as the kangaroos then, where they're jumping at cars left, right, and centre.
No, they don't. I think that the traffic is a problem for kiwis. I hadn't really thought about it too much, but they don't fly. They've got no wings that can get them off the ground, so they're ground nesting. And the problem they have there is that the eggs, which take ages to incubate, are eaten by predators, stoats, things like that we introduced. We being, the colonialists back in the day, 1800s onwards. And there was a lot of talk about that, and there's a lot of controlling going on. And I kept asking the same question to anybody I met in the conservation departments, which they have a very strong department of, but how on earth you could possibly ever get on top of controlling a problem like that, because these areas are just vast and there's no way humans can get to every point. But they were trapping and poisoning in areas in order to try and get on top of these predators, which we had introduced years ago to enable ground nesting birds like kiwis to stand a chance. But it did feel to me, if I'm really honest, like fighting a losing battle. But look, I'm just touring around having a look, and I'm no expert, but it felt very different to the UK, I must say.
So, are there any things that you think British agriculture, British farmers could learn from New Zealand? And in a slightly arrogant way, do you think there's anything that New Zealand farmers could learn from our practices?
Well,
be it regenerative or commercial or however.
I mean, kiwis are pretty resilient creatures. They're farmers, unlike the bird. I've always been in admiration of kiwi farmers. And when the government took away their subsidies, they had to adapt. So you mentioned agroforestry. Is there any agroforestry? So in some areas, they were growing fruits, kiwis, for example, but also, the vineyards, and there's other soft fruits, currants and things like that. And they had created these sort of protective areas with agroforestry. So there was some very big areas of what I'd call small fields with big hedges. And a lot of conifers used, almost look like lelandai to me. And by the way, the plant species in New Zealand are very similar to the UK. I was able to identify loads of plants in the native areas, but also in the fields, in the crops, which I was very familiar with. It really seemed like a home from home in that respect. But the truth is that the Kiwis have really changed their farming system a lot to adapt to world demand. You've got to remember the population of New Zealand is only 5 million people, and they've got a big area of farming. They could produce more food than they would ever need. So the export markets are key. So they have basically developed export markets, and they are well known. I don't need to say that. Well known exponents of that. So yeah, I'm impressed. But when I spoke to The few farmers I spoke to, where we were able to really get into any detail, they were very concerned about succession and very concerned about what their children might do and what prospects they might face, just like we are here in the UK. And I felt there were so many similarities between the two countries. I don't know what... in a high rainfall area on the soil types they have in New Zealand, and it's eminently suited to grassland production. And where areas were sown, there's a lot of grass that isn't sown. A lot of grass is just permanent grass, which is managed. And there's some areas that are sown. And I was really intrigued to see that people were using highly diverse lays in some cases. I mean, not everywhere, but I would guess 10 or 15% of the sown lays that I saw in New Zealand would be diverse. And that would include things like the clovers, the red and white clover, chicory, ribgrass, that type of plant, lucerne, things that we use in the UK for the same reasons, because we're looking for resilience in the farming system. And guess what? Weather was hot topic. If you spoke to farmers or any land managers about the rain or the temperatures, all saying the same thing. I mean, while we were there were dreadful floods in parts of New Zealand, really awful flooding, and extremes in weather are happening just like they are in the UK, and that's drought and flood. And they know that they can, and it's in this newspaper. It's in the other, in the other conversations around the place, where it almost dominates the headlines. The river authorities are really keen to engage with the farmers around protecting watercourses, which I thought was really interesting. Exactly as the same as we're beginning to do in the UK. Similar dialogues around environmental delivery. So I don't know whether I guess we would learn from each other around how to adapt to a different looking future. I think that's the key messaging, really.
Nicely put. And if you think, as we start to wind down our conversation this morning, what do you think are your key take-home messages, not only for yourself that you've learned, but also that you think would be beneficial for viewers, listeners to take away as well?
Well, I was lucky to be able to get the chance to go. I honestly never thought I'd do that, and I always said, yeah, it'd be great. It's on my list of wishful thinking, but actually the reality was brilliant, and I really enjoyed getting away, getting off the farm for a bit, just to it's not something I've done. We'll have a few days off here and there, but it's not to actually get away and to be able to relax and think about what you do next was, I found, really, really useful to see different people's perspectives. But you're never really that far away in the world we live in the global communication field. We were sat in a restaurant one night in Christchurch just before we flew back to London, and we were just chatting to the people next door to us on another table who were Kiwis, and they had been to Clarkson's farm and to the Fox in Oddington, which is part of the Dalesford farming and land business, and which is where we're sort of all neighbours, aren't we? And everywhere you went, there was information that was obviously passing between New Zealand and Australia and the UK, and it was common language, and the communications were really strong. So I realised that the power of a handful of organisations and individuals, you think about Rupert Murdoch as probably one of the most famous Australian communicators, and the power he wielded, or does wield, with his empire in the media, and then bumping into someone that's been to Clarkson's farm, or everyone watched the show. Andy Cato was on here on the podcast, wasn't he, recently, talking about the power of that. Well, yes, it really is a powerful thing, and I think it's important that we tell stories through those channels that are helpful and meaningful to the whole of the food system, because if change is going to come in a way that keeps farmers viable and the food healthy and our environment well, then everybody needs to participate. And we do participate in agriculture because we all eat food 3 times a day.
Lovely stuff. Well, thank you very much for your time this morning. I'll let you go so you can go and enjoy the lovely sun and a slice of delicious matcha cheesecake, which is available now in the FarmED Cafe. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching. Do check us out on social media. Give us a bit of a review if you'd like on all your favourite streaming platforms. And we'll see you next time on the FarmED podcast. Thanks very much.